Hello, everybody, and welcome to Cutting the Grooves of History with your two sharp needles, Jack Stanley and Gavin Rice. Today, we are going to be continuing off of our previous episode in which we discussed cylinders, disc recordings, and the music recorded on them. Today, in this episode, we're going to kind of continue that with how disc recordings kind of dominated the sound recording era and how the progression of music caused for discs to become said dominated or the dominating recording method in that era. So,
Well,
Jack,
that's
would
a
you like to
mouthful
start
there.
off?
Yeah.
I know it is.
So good to see everyone. Fun.
Absolutely.
We're ready to begin again.
Yes.
So would you like to start? Would you like me to talk a little bit? What would you like to do?
Um.
We have this very organized, as you can all see.
Oh, of course. Yes, this is a very scripted, organized
Very
event.
much so. Yes, indeed.
Absolutely.
Indubitably.
You know what? I will start.
Okay.
I'll start off by saying that we left off in about 1905. In our like we talked all the way up until 1905. We discussed Berliners, brown wax, etc., etc. By 1905, where we left off, cylinders are still the main format people are listening to. There are still cylinder phonographs being manufactured. There are new cylinder phonographs being manufactured. And there are new types of cylinders being thought of, such as the 4-minute blue amberol cylinder. By that time, 2-minute cylinders were still the main format of cylinder. 4-minute cylinders did not exist yet. But Edison and his team were already trying to design a way to increase the length of said 2-minute cylinders because the discs could hold way much more time depending on the size of the disc. And by 1905, Eldridge R. Johnson has already owned the patents of Berliner, and he is the one who kind of pioneered the larger disc format. So he realized that he could add more sound to a recording by just expanding the size of the disc. However, Edison kept the same size principle of the cylinder, the length, but he thought of creating a finer groove, similar to, say, an LP or a 45, a micro groove disc. This was quite revolutionary at the time, actually, because everybody's Model C reproducers have a big, fat sapphire stylus that goes right into the big 2-minute grooves. So he thought, why don't we shorten the size of the stylus as well as shorten the size of the groove, and now we can have 200 grooves per inch, whereas the 2-minute cylinders were 100 grooves per inch. So there was kind of a battle between formats just after 1905, going into like the 4-minute cylinder, I believe, was introduced in what, Jack, 1908?
1908, yes.
1908.
And,
So
an interesting little point to catch on to what you're saying here is that they had to offer apologies to their customers that they were several months behind in production of cylinders. That's how popular the 2-minute cylinder was.
Absolutely.
This was not the case with the disc record. They really didn't have to apologize very often for being behind.
Nope.
Even though he had different manufacturers making their records, but the Edison company had to offer apologies way up to about 1907.
True. That's very true.
That's a very important point, how absolutely prevalent the cylinder was.
Yes, and even after 1908, with the introduction of the 4-minute cylinder, there were still 2-minute cylinders being produced. In fact, this cylinder right here, it's a violin solo, is from 1908, and it's a 2-minute. So, and I also have a ragtime cylinder, a piano solo from 1911. So there were plenty.
Is that 2-minute as well?
It's 2-minute, yes.
Okay.
So 2-minute cylinders.
They made 2 minutes till 1912.
I believe that it was one of the last 2 minutes being produced because
Once they got to blue amberol, they got rid of everything.
Yes, the format change was important because they started making machines that could only play 4-minute cylinders, such as the Amberola 1A. They also offered. Now this is interesting because we have format issues nowadays. You know, like For example, to plug in headphones to my iPhone, I have to use one of these. 100 years ago, to play 4-minute cylinders, you had to install a different gearing into the drive gear to spin the mandrel. And you would buy that kit, you would install it yourself, and now your Standard, your Home, your Triumph could now play 4-minute cylinders. But then you had to buy a reproducer for that because
Correct.
your Model C reproducer Sapphire is huge and it does not fit into the fine groove of a Blue Amberol cylinder. So they offered not only Model H reproducers, which have a really thin stylus, that's the Sapphire, to fit into that groove. They also offered a whole new carriage that you could attach to your phonograph to accommodate a Diamond B reproducer, which has a very fine diamond tip rather than a sapphire. And it actually has a larger diaphragm, so you can, hear the music will be reproduced better. So
An interesting thing is once they went to the 4-minute, there was a lot of problem. First off, you're taking the same material of the 2-minute cylinder, and you are forcing onto it double the grooves. And then you're putting a lot more pressure on the groove with that 4-minute reproducer. And the end result was they were breaking down constantly.
yes,
Operatic recordings, when they reached a very high note, there'd be nothing but a scratch. And that's a big, big, major problem. And even though they tried their best, because they described how their 4-minute records were made, they started the vat, and then Mr. Edison would come out of his office with a brown paper bag, and he would walk to the vat, and he would drop the contents of the brown paper bag into the vat of wax material. And all their research, they can't figure out what it is. And they had this wonderful aura of the wizard, which Edison was.
He was.
And everybody went and bought the records, and everybody was pissed off about the records.
Yep.
And that is the reason in 1912 that they have to go to the Blue Amberol cylinder, because the 4-minute cylinder was proving itself to be a disaster and not holding up.
Absolutely was. And the people say that the 4-minute blue Amberols are made out of a celluloid with a concrete innards. I don't want to say innards. A plaster, yes. It's, for example, this would be concrete or plaster rather. And not that does support the celluloid good, but if you were to drop that, the plaster on the inside is going to shatter immediately. And celluloid is flexible. And if that drops and cracks, that celluloid is going to sink into where that chip is. And that's happened. And when you play that, it's going to flutter like crazy. It'll be like, wow, and it is not pleasant to listen to.
The thing is, if you're careful, and people that own cylinders back in the day had learned to be very careful with their wax. So when they got their 4-minute Blue Amberols, they were just as careful, because to drop a cylinder was death. Now with the Blue Amber, I've dropped lots of Blue Amberols, and they just sit there and bounce, and fortunately they don't shatter. But they were tough. They were guaranteed 3,000 plays. Now, who was going to sit there and put down with the pencil and count? I don't know.
I don't know.
The thing is that I have had, and I've lived long enough to have cylinders I owned in my 20s. And I have played them all the time. And here I am now in my 60s, and I still have those cylinders, and they work fine. So it's a testament that those cylinders taken care of will last for a long long time. And I have 40 years of experience with some cylinders.
Yes. And
That's
now,
pretty,
Jack, a very good point to bring up is if you treat your reproducers with care as well. If you
of
are
course.
on top of when the stylus needs to be rotated, you are going to have a really good time listening to some cylinders. And another factor that you have to take into consideration is um, the operation of the motor within your phonograph, as well as the belt, and that was a huge issue with Edison's machines up until the introduction of the Amberola. All of the machines were belt driven, and if it was not right if it was like not at the right tension, you're gonna have
Mhm.
lots of issues when playing back. It's not gonna. There's gonna be a point where you will hear like an up in pitch or a lower in pitch. It all depends on how tight or loose the belt is.
Yeah. It'll
And
sound like it's underwater.
yes, that's correct. Yes. Um, and the blue amberol cylinders, quite frankly, they don't warp and expand as much as
Mhm.
the gold molded or brown wax cylinders, which is a
Sure.
plus. However,
And they're
again,
constant speed. They're constant speed.
that's true.
That's so important.
Yes, that is true. The recording technology with Blue Amberol cylinders improved because when you're recording onto a wax cylinder, it's the way that it cuts into it with the large groove. The fidelity is okay. It sounds pretty good, but with the introduction of the fine groove and the celluloid, um, the way that the sound is cut into the groove improved, like I said. But with the cellulite, it could be able to be reproduced much clearer, actually. So if you
Sure.
listen to Blue Amberol cylinders, they sound much, much, much clearer than
They were
2 minute.
far better than the disc.
Yes, that's true.
Amazingly better than the
Yes.
disc. But if I may, real quick,
Yes, of course.
here is our cylinder. It is a fantastic device, and it's pretty. It's got a nice blue color, hence
It
the
is
blue
pretty.
amberol, and you had your case for it. Here is the situation, and this was the death knell of the cylinder.
Absolutely.
And this is an advertising record for Columbia.
Oh,
What's so
yes.
special about this record? This side. No matter what you did to this cylinder, it could not have side two.
Nope.
That was the shot across the bow for the cylinder industry, that it was archaic already. It just didn't know it.
Right.
And Edison would produce the blue amberol cylinder till 1929.
And they were electrically recorded too. So, imagine fitting
Who
all that
cared?
sound
I mean,
energy. I
who
know.
was listening to him?
No,
You know,
nobody was listening.
when I talked to Edison's son, Theodore, and we were talking about cylinders, and he said, "Why are you interested in cylinders?" I said, "I like them." He said, "We couldn't give them away when we made them."
Hmm. Exactly.
And if you think about it, Edison, I spent 8 months
Hmm.
going through a large batch of Edison's notebooks, trying to understand Edison, learn about Edison, see what
Yes.
made him tick. And the one thing that I found is he didn't give a hoot if he was making money or losing money.
Hmm.
And the Edison Company from 1924 onward with the phonograph saw nothing but red ink.
Absolutely.
And by like 1927, they were losing $2 million a year in that time's money.
Hmm. which is
It's
a lot.
incredible. I mean, it's amazing. But think about this. This is a double-sided record. Totally
Revolutionary
changes.
at the time. Yeah.
Yeah, because the cylinder had a chance when the disc had one side. They were competitors that were somewhat equal. The 4-minute cylinder and the 2-minute cylinder.
And someone
But
thought, hey, let's turn this blank space on the back of our discs into music.
they thought about it for many, many, many times, but
Yes.
they were saying, we're making so much money now.
Mm-hmm.
Why bother?
Right.
And it wasn't until the Columbia Company, Victor had no intention of
No.
putting something on the other side of their records. In
Right.
fact, they fought it tooth and nail until 1923 to put another side on their red seals. They
That's true.
took that long to put a double side on a red seal record.
It took so
Very
many
important.
John McCormick songs where people wanted more.
Oh my. Okay. And so the thing is that you had wonderful, wonderful stuff, but the hierarchy is stuff like this. This is a disc. It's from 1904. How much is it? I don't think you can see it here.
If I'm correct, it's about $1.
$5.
$5. Yeah. Unbelievable.
$5 for one record. The Lucia Sextet was $7. Now think about this. In 1907, 1908, what was the average salary? Like about $5 to $6 a week. So
Mhm.
creating this Mount Everest of sound recording, people saved and people did everything in their power to get these
Mhm.
because it made them look special. It was
Mhm.
like having copies of Thoreau and everybody else. I can't think of the authors right now, but all of the authors of the 19th century, you think of Dickens and the like. This kind of replaced it. You had your albums of Red Seal records just to
Mhm.
show the world you kind of made it. You were it.
That's true. Now, Jack, $5 in 1904 is $165 in today's
There
money.
you are.
So
How
let's keep
much
that
is
in mind.
seven? How much is
$7.
okay? Go to 1907. Go to 1908. Excuse me.
Okay, 1908.
1908. $7.
$222.
Okay, in today's money for one record,
Mm-hmm.
6 singers, and there was a joke at the time that the Lucia Sextet, the translation is, "What restrains me?" And the answer is $7.
Yeah. Yeah.
But the thing is that the Lucia Sextet became a massive, big seller.
True.
It's incredible.
That's
They
true.
created that whole image. See, Edison never did that. Edison never thought to make everything so super expensive. I mean, his machines were expensive, yes,
Mm-hmm.
but the records never ever assumed that kind of a
Absolutely.
hierarchy, one might say. The only
Absolutely.
thing they would do is kind of interesting that the Victor people couldn't do. This is Victor Herbert, by the way,
Mm-hmm.
very famous composer of the late 19th, early 20th century.
Mm-hmm.
And when you would get the cylinder, it would have, if I can get it out of here, a little booklet. And the little booklet would tell you all about everything in the cylinder,
Mm-hmm.
which is really pretty cool. And the Victor people kind of went nuts over this. They said, what the hell can we do? And they said, well, our red seals only have one side. And so what they did, this $3 record, voila, they put a little thing just to compete with Edison.
True. Yes. And one thing I'd also like to discuss is the amount of money you're saving and spending versus each format. So let's talk about how cylinders and Edison phonographs, you have one reproducer with one stylus that you will never have to change until it gets worn out. And that can be 3,000, 10,000, however many plays it takes to completely wear a stylus down. I have
Your
no idea.
lifetime.
Your lifetime, exactly.
Yeah.
So when you buy an Edison phonograph and a 4-minute blue amber cylinder, you could play that cylinder over and over and over again without having to change that stylus. Now, with discs, you had to change the needle after each play of a song. That's just the way it was, because in the inside of the grooves, from the Berliner to the Eldridge R. Johnson Company, it was designed to have a grit on the inside of the grooves. I'm not exactly sure the material, but I believe it's some kind of sand.
Like a graphite.
It's like a graphite. Okay. Like a graphite, which actually wears the needle out first before the disc. That they noticed that when excessive play of a Berliner disc or an early Victor disc, they noticed that without that grit inside the grooves, it was wearing out very fast, just after a few like 50, 100 plays or so.
Yeah, the solid rubber ones would flatten out in areas, and the needle would jump out of the groove and go right across the record.
Exactly, and scratch it, make a bzzz.
Yeah, it was a mess.
Right.
And here, just to interrupt in your part here, is very important. At this moment, with Berliner, the material for the new type of record was developed, and it was developed by a company in Newark, New Jersey, called the Duranoid Company.
Oh,
they
yes.
are the inventors of the material for the 78 RPM record. It's a very important thing. And the Duranoid Company would press the records for Berliner and for Victor.
Yes.
Very important thing.
And some early Victor Monarchs have the D in the just outside of the label for
the Duranoid D, which has been mistakenly stated many times to be a recording machine.
Right.
It's not. Nope. It's Duranoid, and that goes back to 1903. The machine, I believe, is called a Denison machine that they were talking about. And that wasn't used until 1906, 1907. So if you have a record from 1903 with a D on it, we've got a problem. It doesn't fit that scenario.
It does not at all.
It's Duranoid.
Yes. Thank you, Jack. That's very, very important.
That's a big pet peeve with me, because there's a lot of histories that are saying that the D is the Denison machine. It's not. It's Duranoid.
Yes, I agree. Now, format issues with the changing the steel needle, you have to buy needles I'd probably say every few months. If let's just say someone back in 1905 were to buy a Victor front mount Monarch or something, and they are going to have to change the needle after each play of a song. Let's say they listen to one disc every day. That is 365 needles every day. And I'm not sure what?
Every year.
Every year, exactly. And what did I say? Every day.
Every day.
I meant to say every year. I apologize.
Yeah, I know.
Long day. And I'm not sure back in 1905 how many needles were in a pack. I would assume like usually 200 or like 100. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So you're going to have to buy, in a course of a year, you're going to have to buy 3 packs of needles for how much, Jack? Do you know how much they usually went for?
Probably like 50 cents, something like that.
50 cents. So your disc is 75 cents or $5. But it's way too expensive. And, with the Edison machines, you just drop that reproducer on the cylinder and you get to listen to it with no problem. And you can keep doing it over and over again.
Here's the problem. And they actually did this at the Edison Company. They did experiments with Victor records and Columbia records. They had a fellow, the poorest son of a gun they hired to do this. It was in one of the notebooks. He had to take a Victor disc and a Columbia disc, change the needle with each playing, and play each record 150 times. That's like working at It's a Small World at Disney. I mean, that must
Yeah.
have been like crazy.
Oh, he
And
must have
so
had to
what
be
they
put in like a
discovered,
straitjacket.
yeah, after 150 plays, that the Victor record was extremely noisy and pretty well worn out.
Mm-hmm.
However, the Columbia record held out better.
Mm-hmm.
And so they discovered in their research, the Edison Company, just to show that their records were better, their records were playing 1,000 times,
Right.
that the Columbia record was the stronger of the two.
Mm-hmm.
Between Victor and Columbia, held up much better.
Yes.
And the Victor record, after about 150 plays, was in pretty rough shape.
Oh, without a doubt. And the Columbia discs, actually, they have an entirely, completely different inside. They're not stamped right from shellac. They have a layer of paper mache
Right.
in between the.
Yeah, they're composite. They're a
yes.
composite record.
And
they held up better.
Yes, that's true. And they also spin some early ones. The really, really early, like Climax and Columbia, they spin fairly slow. But the, like 1905, 19 teens Columbias, they spin at about 80 RPM. And
no, they tried.
I know. And whereas Victor discs at that time were about 75.3 RPM, or even as slow as 73 RPM.
And I'll repeat, they tried as well.
Yes, that's true. And the higher speed actually, if you listen, it actually improves fidelity just a little bit. And that's just science. The faster you have something spin and you record something onto it, the better the fidelity will be. However, the less time you get. So that's
right.
one
That
setback.
was the big argument with Berliner. That's why he went for like 65 RPM. If he went at 25, you couldn't even understand what was on those grooves. Right. Now, here's an interesting thing. 78 was a concept more than a reality.
Correct.
Recording engineers disagreed at what speed the record should go at. And there were recording engineers that believed that Billy Murray should record at 74.
Mm-hmm.
And Henry Burr should record at 76.
Mm-hmm.
And Caruso should do it at 75.
Yes.
And so you have this mishmash of speed. And you go 2 revolutions faster or lower, you go a half step pretty much. It's
an entire half step up from the original key. And that's an incredible point I'd like to continue about, Jack. People always say that, oh, well, how did they know what speed it was if they if it doesn't say on the label? I'll tell you, a lot of the time when people, let's take just for example, a 1925 Victor Electric Batwing from like November 2nd. I know what disc that is. That's my favorite disc. What a Blue-Eyed Baby You Are, played by Edwin J. McKinley's orchestra, sung by Billy Murray. If you listen to it at 78 RPM, they're going to be playing an F sharp major. If you are a musician, you know that's a very difficult key.
It's a nasty key.
It is a nasty key. And another proof of concept that you have is the fact that they're reading off of a stock arrangement, which I have an example of right here. This is an example of a stock arrangement from 1925. It looks backwards on my camera. I don't think it's backwards for the audience. But this is Don't Bring Lulu, arranged by William J.C. Lewis in 1925. So people such as Ben Selvin, Nathan Glantz, even as far as Jan Garber have read off of this sheet, this exact sheet music. These pieces of sheet music were the most important things to happen to dance bands. We're going to talk about that another time. But for now, as I'm saying, if you can see, this well, for E flat alto, that's 3 sharps, which is A major. An A on an alto sax comes out as a concert C. So you
Mhm.
know that whatever they're reading off of, and actually coincidentally, the sheet music for the piano solo, which everyone heard first before the recording, is in C major. Arrangers at the time very rarely switched the key off of the sheet music. If the sheet music called for the piano solo to be in D major, they would probably bring it up to E flat major. But again,
Mhm.
as I was saying, um, Edwin J. McKinley was reading off of the 1925 stock arrangement entitled "What a Blue-Eyed Babe You Are" in F major. So that's another proof that you have that even though the disc is at 78 RPM, it's not at the right speed. I refrain from calling my discs 78s. I call them shellac discs. That's just, or discs, records, whatever. I just don't do it because 78 RPM is a concept. It was
Yes, it
never a
is. It
reality,
is.
barely.
It is a concept. And what speed is that record going at?
That record is at 75.8 RPM because
Okay. Yeah.
this was
All right.
because of the electrical process. It needed to be a little faster than 74 because Billy Murray is singing. So,
Mhm.
of course, Billy was at 74, so they needed to raise it just a smidge for the instruments. Um, and that is at 75 RPM. That is a huge difference from 78. And that is a
Sure.
half step up from the music, the original sheet music, So it's very important to
It's
check
a
with the sheet music.
it's it's a fascinating and bizarre thing about that whole arena of recording is how they talked as dogma that the records were 70.
Yeah.
Do not touch your speed control. Your records are carefully done in the laboratory. Blah 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 blah
Blah,
blah.
blah. I know.
Now it's a different thing with Edison. Now, once Edison went into the disc industry, and yes, there are a few mistakes, but they would tune at a certain to make sure they got the speed correct. They would blow a certain key, like let's say A flat, and once they got A flat and everything set with their recording machine, then they would do the thing. So they would be exactly at 80.
Right.
That was important. 80 RPM was Edison. Victor was supposedly 78. Columbia was supposedly 80. But as we well know, Victor records are as slow as 67 RPMs.
Absolutely. Yes. And that even
Really
goes
scary.
back to the 1920s. There are
Sure.
1920s Victor recordings as slow as 67 RPM. It
Yeah.
just depends on the singer. And another theory I have is actually, I believe that, well, actually, no, it just all goes down to, in reality, to whoever the singer is, because their voice, and that goes back to dictation cylinders. Dictation cylinders, now I'm not talking about dictaphone cylinders, but if you look at a Triumph Model A with on the speed knob, there are 3 settings: 120, 160, and 200, I believe. Mine's a little faded,
Mhm.
but you would usually, for language learning cylinders, you would slow that down all the way to 80 RPM for a cylinder. That is slow. And you can make it out, but that's just for talking. For music, they
Correct.
were around 120, 160, 200. As I
Mhm.
was saying, the higher the speed, the better the fidelity. That's just the way it is.
And that was the history of the cylinder. The standard cylinder was 120 for quite a while.
Yes, that's true. That's
Until
true.
1900, 1901, that they actually went to 160 once
Yes,
they started with the molded, which,
that's
by the
true.
way, interesting thing, just to throw in, there's so many fascinating little stories here. Um, they were trying to make their molded cylinder, the Columbia Company and Edison, and stealing from each other like crazy. They all had operatives in each other's company. The big problem with molding a cylinder is how the hell do you get it out of the mold? That's a big problem. And they had these wonderful, and they still exist, these wonderful molds, but you can't get the damn record out. And so they had to develop a mold that was big enough to allow it to shrink and fall out into a mitt. But that was one of the things that held up the molding of records, because it's a totally different thing than stamping out a disc record. You have to all sides, cover all sides, and allow enough space for the cylinder to come out. That's a very, very important thing, and something that caused a lot of problems.
True. Absolutely. If you don't mind, I'm going to have to mute every time Jack is talking because my headphones died. So here's a good compatibility issue in the 2020s. You know, once your headphones die, you got to use your computer speakers, which my microphone will actually pick up. So don't worry about that. It's okay. I've got it figured out. But
You're right.
yeah, no, it's okay. It's all good. The microphone shouldn't pick up too much. But anyway.
Okay. Well, I'm doing the same thing. I'm doing this. I'm Mr. Low Tech over here, and I'm on a phone.
Right. That's okay, Jack. Now, I'd really like to bring up the point that as music was progressing, discs could handle that progression much finer, much cleaner, much clearer, and much better than the cylinder. And that, unfortunately, is just the way it is. The progression of jazz. There's a reason why the original Dixieland Jazz Band recorded on discs rather than cylinders. Because if you listen to jazz cylinders, quite frankly, they are all over the place and honestly one of the least pleasant things to listen to. I'm sorry. That's because there's just so much going on, and the cylinder, there's just so much, you know, the way that it rotates. Unless you have a perfectly reamed cylinder, there's going to be issues with it playing back, unfortunately.
Sure, you have to have a machine that plays perfectly steady. I mean, I have an Amberola 5, and it's wonderful. It's got a big weight on the end that spins and keeps everything perfectly steady. And it makes recording a lot better. But there are many times with cylinders, you get that, that thing that kind of, you know, that kind of convinces you maybe that scotch is needed or something.
Absolutely.
You know?
Yes, I agree.
But, you know, you're so right with jazz. We had some issues, of course. The first record, incidentally, that mentions the word jazz is on Edison. It's from 1914, and they spell jazz Jas.
Yes.
And it's called Listen to the Jazz Band. And
Yes.
It's Collins and Harlan. And they're saying, what is a jazz band? And so what they do is the orchestra is trying to play like a jazz band, which they have no idea what a jazz band sounds like. It's really kind of a funny recording to listen to, but it's the first that mentions jazz. But Victor is the one that put out the first jazz record. I got it right here. Here it is, the first jazz record ever released.
I was going to get my copy, but I'm glad you got it too.
Well, you can get your copy. We can show it to each other.
It's in another room. That's okay.
But this is called the Dixie Jazz Band One Step. And of course, Gavin here knows a million things more about jazz bands than I do. But I just wanted to show this example. And another example, real quick, before I let Gavin go on jazz. This is the first piano jazz record. And it's called Keep Off the Grass. And the pianist
James
is
P. Johnson.
James R. Johnson. And of course, one of the great early jazz composers. And if you're interested in a song called The Charleston,
he's your guy.
it was written by him. But he is the person on the first piano jazz record. That's pretty cool, I think.
And James P. Johnson is a pioneer in transitioning from ragtime to stride piano. So if you're not familiar with stride piano, it's similar to ragtime in which you have bass, chord, bass, chord. However, James P. Johnson decided that doing bum 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 was kind of boring. So he decided to add a little, he utilized all of his fingers. Because when you have a big hand and you can, let's just say I have an invisible piano in front of me. My pinky's playing C. I have a big enough hand where my thumb can reach an E, which is a third apart, or um, it's there. It's a tenth. There's twelfths and thirteenths. As that's a music theory lesson that I don't really want to get into right now. But um, if speaking simply, it is a third above C. So
Okay.
in between hitting C and the chord, you can do like ba-dun dun 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 dun, which adds kind of a rhythmic variation and
Mhm.
kind of sounds like you're a drummer or a bass player at the time.
Mhm.
Um, and that was revolutionary. And this type of piano playing goes way back, even, but James P. Johnson wasn't really recording that much, but he was, yes, he was a pioneer of that.
Indeed.
And now I'd like to talk about the very beginnings of jazz, and I will continue it in a later episode. But I'm just going to talk about the very beginnings of jazz and why jazz was mainly recorded on discs rather than cylinders. So to start right at the beginning, you have two major genres of music by the time the first jazz record was being recorded. You have dance music, military band music, and ragtime. These are your three main genres of music that you have at that time. Dance music typically was composed of large, not very large, but good sized orchestras, violin, cornet, trombone, traps, also known as drums. Cello was very popular. The banjo, not yet, but piano to keep the time, either tuba or bass. Um, and military music played by military bands. My most
Mhm.
the example I bring up most of the time, I use Conway's band. He was a great example of a combination of a military band and a dance band. So
Mhm.
he kept the drive and feel of a military band, but he actually played dance tunes. And there's a great example called Sis Boom Ah. I really like that recording. And he it's actually very danceable. It's a one step, I believe, and it is a one step actually. And the tempo's ba da ba 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 ba. So, and that was recorded, I believe, in 1916. And
Mhm.
that was even before jazz. So you have dance music, military music, and what else did I say? Ragtime. So ragtime, yes, Jack.
Got a question for you, real quick, just for my edification here. Is there was a whole plethora of songs, "Ball and the Jack," um, songs like "Walking the Dog," um, all these different things, and they were dances as well as music. And I was just wondering if you could explain that a little bit.
The what? The difference in dancing and music, or the combination of
Well,
both?
well, like "Ball and the Jack." Is that jazz or is that not jazz?
Okay, so that is a very good question. Uh, if you listen to Ball and the Jack, let's just say someone like Conway's band were to play it. His
Okay.
musicians would read directly off of the music. They wouldn't really improvise too much. So,
Mhm.
in my opinion, that may be a popular jazz tune, but it lacks the form of improvisation that is crucial for jazz. Um,
Okay.
if you listen to the original Dixieland Jazz Band, they are not reading off of any music, not a single one of them. In fact, Nick LaRocca couldn't read music, so that's you just know that. The story of Nick LaRocca, he was a Sicilian. His family was Sicilian immigrants, and he really wanted to play music, but his father was like, "You are not playing music by any means." So Nick fought against his dad's orders. He worked and worked and worked, bought himself a cornet. He
Mhm.
played it in secret when his dad was at work, but unfortunately, one day his dad found the cornet and threw it down a well. Um, and I believe I've heard stories of this. I'm not sure exactly if it's true, but he actually went down in the well and he got it and he kept playing it. And if you look at photos of the original Dixieland Jazz Band, you can actually see his cornet is a little bent. So yes, and this Nick could not read music. A lot of them couldn't read music, but that is a crucial thing to have in jazz is the key of improvisation. Now,
Sure.
there's a
Here's what
very
I
fine
need to
line.
toss in real quick is when they recorded, the engineers didn't know what to do.
No, nope. And actually, the original Dixieland Jazz Band called for a new form of balance. Um, Anthony Sparbaro, the drummer, he was a crazy drummer. And if you listen to the recordings and kind of mess with the EQ a little bit, you can hear how he is at the opposite end of the room, whereas Nick is right up to the
Oh, yeah,
horn.
they put him in the other room. Yeah,
Yeah.
they didn't know what to do with him.
Yes, no, they had to because he was such a crazy drummer. They almost removed their contract because they thought they couldn't record them because Nick was such or not Nick, sorry. Tony was such a hard player on the bass drum because there was no bass player in that group. You have Frank Signorelli on the piano, you have Nick LaRocca on cornet, Tony Sparbaro on drums, Eddie Edwards on trombone, and Larry Shields on clarinet. That was the setup. No bass player. So Nick LaRocca had to be the bass player on the bass drum. If you turn up the EQ in the recordings, you hear boom, 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 boom. And he is smashing it with his beater. And he actually had an overhanging beater on his drum on his trap set, meaning that the pedal, usually people notice drum pedals, the beater kind of slams into the bass drum like this. His pedal actually hung off the top, connected to a string, connected to a pedal. Whenever you would push the pedal, it would directly hit the bass drum kind of in the opposite way, but it still did. And that doesn't really affect anything. I just think that's a little interesting.
It just makes it loud, I would imagine. It makes increases
a little
the
bit.
volume.
No,
Now,
not really.
One other thing that we should mention real quick is that blasting is a big problem with lateral recording.
Yes.
And
yeah.
and they came in and there was nothing. I mean, they didn't know what to do with them. And it's amazing that they actually got the recordings out. I'm amazed. Especially when you had Harry McDonough in charge.
I agree. Yeah, seriously. It was like it was a miracle that it got released. Seriously. They had to try so hard to get the balance just right. And they did. They did, but at the time let me double check. Let me check here.
I got I'm looking here. Okay, what was the first take on Livery Stable Blues?
But the Dixie Jazz Band one step, that may be different.
That's going to be different. I can see it's different. Except my eyes aren't good enough to read it.
You want me to pull it up on?
Hold on, there it is. It's either 3 or 5.
Yeah, I would assume 5 because it took a long time to get the balance right.
I'm sure.
And if you look at old setups of recording studios, the drummer for ragtime groups or dance groups, the drummer was usually just on the wood block the entire time. But there actually was snare drum, but barely. But they weren't playing as loud as Tony. And all of these musicians were so loud, and that's just the way they played. I personally love it. I really like it when they play really loud, and I wish I could have heard that. But if you're someone in 1970, I will say, Nick LaRocca, the leader of the original Dixieland Jazz Band, claims that they started in 1908. They were formed as early as 1908. That's what he says. Nick LaRocca says that he invented jazz, which I personally disagree with. I believe that there is no inventor of jazz. I believe that the closest thing we have to an inventor of jazz is W.C. Handy writing the Memphis Blues. If you take a look at his notes, he took a trip down to Memphis, down to Louisiana, down to St. Louis, and he actually heard the freed slaves of their time. He heard their songs. He heard their slave songs, their traditional songs, and he was genuinely the first person to write it down using Western, techniques of writing down music. And the Memphis blues, if you listen to the melody, or I'll do the St. Louis blues for an example. The da 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 ba da 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 da. If you hear those blue notes, ba da da, for that's D, E flat, E, B flat, A, G. That's the key that the song was written in. That was huge at the time because Western musicians were not using those passing tones very often, and that has so many of them. Da 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 da. It's unbelievable how he figured out how to write that down because nobody even bothered to do that. But I digress.
Cool.
I digress. But Nicholas LaRocca, sorry, go ahead.
Just real quick. Now, the second company to introduce jazz records was Edison.
Yep. Earl Fuller's famous jazz band.
There it is, the first one. It's the Johnson Jazz Blues.
Or is it the Frisco?
That's
what I meant. The Frisco Jazz Band. I apologize. That's what I meant. It had some people. There was Nathan Glantz, I believe, in that one. On clarinet or saxophone.
I'll take your word.
Yeah.
But it was recorded, of course, on disc. This is the cylinder version. But nonetheless, it's a very, very important thing. But it's interesting to note that the Edison jazz record didn't have any kind of the impact that the Victor did, nor did the cylinder. They're already dying out.
Yeah, that's right. I apologize for thinking that was Earl Fuller's famous jazz band he recorded for Victor. The Frisco Jazz Band was formed by Rudy Wiedoeft. And if you don't know who he was the most famous saxophone player at the time. He revolutionized the saxophone. And if you look at early saxophones, I didn't bring my saxophone, but I have a saxophone from 1865. And if you look at it, the keywork is beyond primitive. Rudy Wiedoeft, or Wiedoeft, it's EI, so it's Wiedoeft. He revolutionized the way saxophones were played, manufactured, and sounded. That's
one of the reasons Rudy Valley changed his name.
True.
Yeah, because he played saxophone, and he changed his name to, I forget what his real name is.
Let me double check that another time. But yes, no, and he was and it's interesting how Rudy Wiedoeft, this novelty saxophone player at the time, was forming a jazz ensemble as early as that recording is what, 1918, 1917?
Yeah, 1917, 1918.
And talking about blasting on the discs, if I'm correct, the Victrola No. 2 reproducer came out after that disc was released, the original Dixieland Jazz Band disc.
Yeah, right around that time. Yes.
There was
1917.
Yeah, there was no way that exhibition reproducer could handle the volume and sound energy of the jazz discs.
And remember this, that these records wore out real fast.
Oh, real fast, believe me. Yeah.
Real. It's hard to find them in good condition.
True.
It's an interesting thing. Now, one of the people that was very involved in these early jazz things is an individual who became very famous later in movies, and television, and radio. And his name was Jimmy Durante. And Jimmy Durante was playing piano in these early jazz bands. And I found many Edison records where the composer was Jimmy Durante.
Yes.
And we don't give him credit we think of him as the, cha-cha, good night, Mrs. Calabash, wherever you are, that kind of stuff. But early on in his career, he was very much involved in the jazz scene.
True. That's
Yeah.
very true. Now, I'd like to segue into the transition or in the combination of dance bands and jazz bands. The typical setup of a jazz band in 1917, according to the first recording, we're going to use that as a reference. We have piano, clarinet, trombone, cornet, and drums. 5 people. No bass, no saxophone. In fact, people thought saxophone was a parasite in jazz. That's Edison's words, actually.
Well, yeah, he said it wasn't designed for jazz.
No.
Sousa said the same.
Sousa said the same thing. Lots of people, even going back to the invention of the saxophone, people hated it. So that's a discussion for another time. But we're going to talk about an individual named Paul Whiteman.
Oh, yeah.
He is credited in symphonizing syncopation, as the advertisement said. Paul Whiteman was born in Colorado in 1890, right on the money, 1890. His work as a violinist, actually, he was a violinist. He played with little groups around Colorado, but he got a job in LA at the, what hotel was it again, Jack? I'm just blanking very quickly.
I don't know. I honestly don't know the name of the hotel in California.
Paul Whiteman, the Ambassador Hotel.
Oh, the Ambassador. Oh, okay.
It says that on the Japanese Sandman, Paul Whiteman and his Hotel Ambassador Orchestra.
Ah. Okay.
So he started with a different one earlier than that. I actually looked it up. It's still there in LA, by the way. The hotel he first started at, but in 1919. But what he did at the Hotel Ambassador, he decided to have 2 saxophones, trumpet, not cornet, that's very important, trumpet, trombone, bass, string bass first, but in the recordings you hear brass bass, also known as tuba or sousaphone. I said trombone, brass bass, drums and piano, and banjo. The banjo, very, very important. Banjo, before jazz, was either a ragtime instrument or an Appalachian instrument. It had a few more purposes. Irish music, very, very important. But people like Van Epps and Osman used a 5-string banjo. That's also known as the classical banjo, but Mike Pingatore, the banjist in Paul Whiteman's group, played a tenor banjo. The tenor banjo has 4 strings, not 5 strings, making it easier to strum. That was mainly its job. It was to strum, whereas the 5-string was played with fingers and played more melodic stuff. Mike Pingatore, in my opinion, he was one of the earliest pioneers for the tenor banjo, in my honest opinion. But if you listen to the early recordings, there is improvisation within his recordings. The first Paul Whiteman recording, the Japanese Sandman and Whispering, it's very 19-teens dance-esque, but there are moments of improvisation within the instruments. They are reading, for the Japanese Sandman, the other side, they're reading off of the stock arrangement. And I know that because I have the stock arrangement myself. The same music they read off of, but they improvised, which was a key in playing jazz, like I mentioned. Whereas take someone like Joseph C. Smith's dance orchestra, there are rarely very straightforward. There's like barely any improvisation, if any. If there was, it would be like in the right hand of the piano, which is barely.
It was the Lawrence Welk of jazz. Let's put it that way. Okay.
I like that. It is the Lawrence Welk of jazz. So Paul Whiteman, he made sure he utilized improvisation. Very important. Paul Whiteman, like I said, was a pioneer of creating the dance orchestra, the jazz orchestra. Let's take that.
Okay.
I have a book. It's actually in that room over there, entitled "Jazz" by Paul Whiteman himself. He wrote it in 1926. He mentions that he listened to the original Dixieland Jazz Band recordings, and he thought to himself that the instruments needed more. They needed. I was just going to say there needs to be more instruments. So he used. Now I will talk about the stock arrangements one more time. Uh, Everybody knows that a jazz band, let's say in the year 1920, or a dance orchestra, Paul Whiteman's used trumpet, trombone, saxophone one, saxophone two, piano, banjo, drums, and bass. So
Mhm.
at that time, that's really what the stock arrangements had available. In this stock arrangement, there are actually oboe parts, there are clarinet parts, there are bassoon parts, there are flute parts. Paul Whiteman decided to not use those. He decided that the two saxophones, trumpet, trombone, banjo, piano, bass, whatever, he thought that was the setup for jazz.
That would be the core. That would be the core.
He thought that would be the most important core because all of those instruments, they blend really well together. They sound really. Now, I will say, his musicians, Charles Dornberger, he started playing saxophone with Paul Whiteman. He doubled on. He mainly played E flat alto, C melody, tenor, clarinet, oboe, bassoon, and heckelphone. So if Paul Whiteman
Okay.
said,
What
yes.
is a heckelphone?
A heckelphone is let's just say, I'm going to try and describe it in the best way possible. Classically, it's known as the bass oboe, I believe, but in jazz, the heckelphone. Imagine an English horn, but
Okay.
twice the size.
Uh-huh.
It uses a double reed, much like an oboe or bassoon, but it
Okay.
has a bulb at the end of the instrument.
Okay.
Whereas the bassoon had a bell, it just kind of,
Mhm.
the oboe had a bell, the heckelphone had a bulb, and that created actually a very interesting sound. In
Bass, it's the bass sound, right?
No, Charles Dornberger played that. I actually am not entirely sure if there are any recordings of him playing heckelphone. I believe there is. I just can't think of it right now. But
Okay.
it was a very lyrical solo novelty instrument. It was not the
Okay.
bass instrument. So
Now I have a question for you.
yes.
How did Paul Whiteman record? What was the setup? Do we know what the setup was?
Yes,
Like,
actually.
how do we make acoustic recordings? You're bringing in all these crazy instruments, and here I am, John McDonald, who used to be called Harry McDonough, and I'm in charge of the studio. And I think The Holy City is a great record. And here you are with this jazz crap,
Yep.
which is basically the way he felt about it. And so, how did they set up this band to record it well?
Yes, very good question. Much like the original Dixieland Jazz Band, the drummer was usually behind the group. But in this case, the drummer was not as crazy as Tony Sbarbaro. So he could be a little closer. And you can hear woodblock. The woodblock, I will, just to preface, I'm going to mention woodblock a lot. That is the most important percussion instrument that drummers played at that time because it cut through the band like a knife and it etched really cleanly on recordings. If you listen to early ragtime discs, you'll hear on the woodblock like the entire time. So that's just the way it was. They substituted that for the snare drum a lot of the time. But the setup, you have trumpet, trombone on one horn. You'll have the two saxophones on another horn, piano, or actually, I'm trying to think. Let me just give me a second.
Sure.
As far as Victor at 1920, uh, if I had to, I haven't seen any photos of the 1920 studios recording Paul Whiteman,
Mhm.
but if I had to make an educated guess based off of evidence that I've seen, based off of science, acoustical science, and based off of the way instruments sound, I would assume one big horn right in the middle, capturing the piano, banjo, and drums about very close to each other. Off
Mhm.
to the side, you have trumpet, trombone on one side, and saxophone 1 and saxophone 2 on the other side. So you have 3 horns in total. Paul Whiteman would have played violin into one of those horns. I'm not sure which one. Probably the big one in the front.
Did he play the stro?
Paul Whiteman, I cannot confirm or deny. I assume he had one.
Mhm.
But if you look at photos of him with the hotel orchestra, you can just see him holding a normal violin.
Yeah, that makes sense.
The
Just
Stroh
wondering.
violin,
It's just
yeah.
just
This
wondering about that.
Yes, the Stroh violins were mainly used with studio groups. You know,
Mhm.
if you are looking at a Victor disc that says blah 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 with orchestra accompaniment, they're most likely using Stroh violins. And if you're
Okay.
not familiar of what a Stroh violin is, it is a thin violin with actually a something very similar to a phonograph reproducer connected to the bridge, which is the wooden. Do I have my
Mhm.
violin here? Oh, of course I don't. Well, it has the bridge is the
Sorry to ask the question here.
no. It's okay. I'm just this is funny. Let me go get my violin and I'll demonstrate. Give me 1 second.
Sure.
I'll be right back. Okay, I have my violin.
Okay.
So on your violin, this is your bridge.
Hmm.
Your bridge is what transfers the vibration to the front of the violin. Inside, there's a sound post. There's no way I can show. Oh, there it is. See that post right there?
Hmm.
That's your sound post. That distributes the vibrations to the back of the violin. The whole thing vibrates and comes out of the F holes. This is your standard acoustic violin. Terribly out of tune because I haven't touched it in a little while. But that is the main principles of an acoustic wooden violin like that. The Stroh
Hmm.
violin is about, see the length of this fingerboard? Imagine that is the violin. So cut these 2 ends off. Um, at this point, the bridge connects to a metal, sometimes mica, but mainly metal diaphragm, which connected out to a horn. And that meant you could play the violin like this and angle the horn wherever you well, a lot of the time they didn't move, but the horn would point right out, straight out, and you could
To the recording
to
horn.
the
Yeah.
recording horn, exactly. Um, and they did not sound as good as wooden violins, but if you're in a full orchestra, you did what you could to make sure it would
It's
sound
an acoustic recording. It didn't really matter
exactly.
in
So
that regard, in many respects, when you think about it.
right.
I did a bunch of experiments years ago with Stroh violins making cylinder recordings. And it was fascinating to do. And every violinist that played the Stroh violin hated it because some of them had this little thing sticking up for an ear thing, and it was shooting this terrible high streaky volume into
It
their
was
ear.
tinny, very, very
Yeah,
tinny.
and it sounded like Jack Benny on a good day. For those of you who know who Jack Benny is,
I
going
can
back a little
confirm.
bit.
Yes, I can confirm that. I actually have played on a Stroh violin myself. They aren't pleasant to really play and listen to, but you did what you did. You know, you got paid. Those guys got paid to do.
They achieved the objective, which was present as much sound as possible to the horn. Sometimes a regular violin, you're losing so much
Yes.
going to the recording horn,
Because
especially
the
if
F
you're in a
holes are
band.
angled. Yes, the F holes are
Yes,
angled upward. So in order to, I've done this, in order to play into a recording horn, you had to play like this. That's just the way
right.
it was. That is very uncomfortable to play. Very uncomfortable. And a lot of the time, they actually had to, if you look at photos of Charles Delmain recording, they had to raise the machine and the piano up and angle the
Right,
horn
and the
down.
horn, yeah.
Yes, right down into the violin. Paul Whiteman didn't do that. He didn't mind playing right into the horn. But as I was saying, that is probably the setup of his group. That's how they balanced it. And they were reading right off the music with improvisation. So this is genuinely one of probably the first times that I know of a dance orchestra reading off of a stock arrangement that a lot of dance orchestras and military bands read off of, that they improvised off of. They didn't play it straight through. They decided to, do whatever. They if they wanted to do a little lick somewhere, they did it and it worked, So that's the very beginnings of jazz. I'd like to also talk about the ensemble setup, the orchestration. Like I was mentioning, Charles Dornberger, he had 7 or 8 different instruments in front of him. With a military band, someone playing clarinet is going to play clarinet the whole time. Someone playing saxophone is going to play the saxophone the whole time. Someone playing oboe is going to play oboe the whole time. With Paul Whiteman's setup and his very versatile and talented musicians, they could stop playing saxophone in a matter of a measure, which is 4 beats, if a typical foxtrot. So like 1, 2, 3, 4. They have about 2 seconds to pick up a different instrument and play it. So this was the introduction of the saxophone player being the most versatile musician in the orchestra. So they would quickly switch from alto saxophone to soprano saxophone, or alto saxophone to clarinet, or alto saxophone to heckelphone, And by the way, when I mean saxophone 1, saxophone 2, that's a habit of mine written in the stock arrangements. It says saxophone 1, saxophone 2. Saxophone 1 was E flat alto, and saxophone 2 was either C melody or tenor, the B flat tenor.
Now for the gentleman record collector who's totally confused by keys, I would love to have you explain what instruments work well with acoustic recording. What instruments didn't work good with acoustic recording? Because we know that it was a very, very picky instrument when it came to recording. So what did record best?
Great question. Number 1, right off the bat, cornet. I'm just cornet or trumpet.
From the beginning.
Yep. Scientifically, that is the number 1 best instrument that is going to sound good in a recording. It can play loud. It can play quiet. It has a very direct tone. And there have been cornet solos going back to Berliner. So that's just simple as that. Second, I'd probably say other brass instruments such as trombone, euphonium, etc. Another thing about the trumpet and the trombone, the bell's facing right forward.
Sure.
With the euphonium,
like a weapon.
With the euphonium or alto horn, the bell is facing up. So
I did notice something very fascinating in looking at the records of recording sessions. French horn, they were equipped with a mirror.
Yes.
Because they're facing the other way.
Yes.
But they're sitting there with a big mirror so they can watch everything that's going on.
That's a great point, Jack. Yes. So French, for people who don't know, French horn players at that time, French horns, I will say French horns at that time were piston valved instruments. That was the original French horn, not the rotary valve French horn.
Right.
The original, yes, the original French horn, that is a French horn. A rotary valved horn is not a French horn because it does not have the French piston valves. That's just, I want to put that out there. So their bells, that you have the lead pipe mouthpiece curl, then the bells are going backwards. So a French horn player needs to have their hand in the bell to hold it, first of all, but their sound is going downwards. They needed to turn around the opposite of the band so that their bell would face forward. But when you're facing opposite and the conductor's going, you can't see the tempo. So they would actually put mirrors in front of them so you could see the conductor directing the beat. And these are just little nuances of acoustic recordings that have just been the reality for like a matter of like 20 years or so, like 20, 30 years.
I was fortunate when I talked to Theodore Edison. He would talk about like how they used to set up all kinds of stands for different instruments.
Yes.
Have them far away, close up, the angle, all these various, very, very minute things that would make a record a success or a failure.
Yes.
It was really kind of amazing. And I have to go into more detail about some of that stuff later, but
absolutely.
We have been working and talking quite a bit here.
We have. I'll finish the question that you asked, and then I think that'll wrap up this
I
episode.
think we've been going on for a while. Yeah.
Sure.
This has been fascinating. I'm learning a lot, so this is always good.
Me
You
too.
know?
This is wonderful. So to wrap up your question, probably the least best recording instrument would probably be the saxophone. And it's been like that since the dawn of recording. If you listen to the Seaflower Polka, which is a saxophone solo, it sounds like crap. And that's number one, due to the technology of the time. Two, that's saxophone technology of the time. And three, the way they played the saxophone. Saxophone has such a specific sound. And it was a very modern instrument compared to all of the rest of them. The trumpet goes back to the 1600s.
Sure.
If you ask my girlfriend Nora all about it, she loves Baroque trumpet. She has a Baroque trumpet, actually. It's not from the Baroque era, but it is a straight trumpet. It has one
Straightforward,
chord.
yeah.
Yes, but it doesn't have any valves. And you use
Mhm.
the partial series to play notes. Hers has holes because I'll get into that later. But the trumpet goes back 400, hundreds of years, 400 years. The trombone goes back to that same era, the Baroque era. It was originally called the sack, but
They recorded well, yes.
yes, they recorded very well. But the saxophone was invented in 1848, and keep in mind the phonograph was invented in 1877. So these instruments have had 400 years to improve, whereas the saxophone in the dawn of recording has only had a mere 60, 70 years, So
Sure. Another instrument that I wanted to mention is going through Edison's notebooks. He felt that the harp would not record well.
That's true. The harp definitely did not record
So he drew a picture of a harp where he wanted it. And then they made the recording and it blew people away. It recorded so well.
Yes.
And so they had to move it back. So those ping, ping, pings, like a banjo, they carry so amazingly well. And remind me, eventually, I want you to hear, I have a harp test record.
Oh, please. Yes, please send
made
that.
Acoustically.
Please.
And it's pretty amazing. They discovered that it recorded far better than they expected.
Please do. I would love to hear that. Okay, so that's going to wrap up that question. And I believe we are done with this episode.
I think we have talked a little bit here. Yes. And we have so much more to talk about. My goodness. Absolutely. And we will be having a guest soon. We'll have our first guest, and we plan on having a whole bunch of guests and speakers and researchers and historians and musicians. I think it'll be so much fun.
Yes.
It's just beginning here. This is just the beginning. We're going to grow and do all kinds of fun stuff. And we'll have two sharp needles doing all kinds of fun things.
Yes.
Digging our needles into various aspects of history and whatever it may be.
Thank you, everybody, for listening. We will continue this in our next episode, so stay tuned. And this has been Cutting the Grooves of History with your two sharp needles. Goodbye.
Good to see you. Bye.